The great hall of Ashmore had been dressed for a wedding. White roses banked the gallery rails, their scent thick and sweet in the June air. Footmen in powdered livery stood at measured intervals along the stone corridor. Guests in silk and broadcloth crowded the long receiving room where 3 hours hence a second marriage was to begin, and the Dowager Duchess of Ashmore stood at the hall's center in gray-watered silk, her fan held at a precise height that communicated satisfaction and command in equal measure. She was looking at the door. Cecily Hartwell stood in that doorway with her 2 eldest sons at either hand and her youngest balanced on the hip of a plain-faced woman behind her. 3 years had passed since Ashmore had seen her. She wore gray wool, too, though hers was travel-worn at the hem, and she carried no fan, and she had not been invited. The dowager's gaze moved from Cecily's face to the children, and then back, and something shifted behind her eyes that no one else in the room was close enough to read. Cecily did not look at the dowager. She looked at the staircase at the hall's far end, and at the man who stood at the top of it, and she kept her spine exactly straight. What followed that morning would be spoken of in 3 counties for 30 years. But the story did not begin in a flower-dressed hall. It began 3 years earlier, on an April morning when a solicitor came to Ashmore with papers, and Cecily Hartwell, who had been a duchess for 3 years, became nothing at all. She had been Cecily Alderton before Edmund Hartwell, Duke of Ashmore, married her in the private chapel on his Wiltshire estate in the autumn of 1809. She was 22 years old, the younger daughter of a country clergyman who had recently died, and she had nothing to recommend her to a man of Edmund's consequence, except what the hierarchy refused to measure: a steadiness that held even when the world pressed hard, and a quality of honest perception that saw things as they were rather than as they were arranged to appear. Edmund had seen it once, at a dinner party in Bath, when she told the hostess quietly and without apology that the assessment the room had just rendered of a mutual acquaintance was both unkind and inaccurate. The room had gone silent. Cecily had picked up her fork. Edmund had not looked away from her for the remainder of the evening. He offered for her the following month. The Dowager Duchess, his mother, had been in London and was not consulted. By the time she arrived at Ashmore, the wedding had already taken place. The Dowager came into the drawing-room on a Tuesday morning, removed her gloves 1 finger at a time, looked at Cecily with the measured attention a jeweler gives a stone brought to him without a certificate, and said, "A clergyman's daughter. From Bath." She sat down. She did not say it was impossible. She was far too careful a woman for that. She simply proceeded, from that morning onward, to act as though the thing had not happened in the way it had happened, and would eventually be corrected. Cecily understood the message perfectly. She did not allow it to change her behavior. The first year at Ashmore was not unkind to her. Edmund was a reserved man, formed by responsibility rather than warmth, and the Dowager's permanent residence at the east wing of the estate was a daily pressure. But Cecily found small ways to be useful. She organized the household accounts with a clarity that the former steward said he had not seen in his 20 years of service. She learned the names of every tenant on the estate's 1,200 acres. She visited the cottages in November when the cold came early. These were not performances. They were simply what she did, because she had been trained from childhood to do what was present and necessary. Edmund watched. He did not say much, but she caught him watching, in the particular way that a still pond catches light without making any sound about it. The difficulty arrived in the 2nd year, and then again in the 3rd. A pregnancy in 1810 ended in the 4th month. Another in 1811 came closer to its term and did not survive it. The second loss was a daughter. A child born still in a February night with snow at the windows, and Edmund sat in the corridor outside Cecily's room for 8 hours without moving, and when she was well enough to see him, he came in and stood at the window and said nothing for a long time, and what he finally said was not about her at all. It was about himself, about what he should have done, about what he might have prevented. It was the particular language of a man who had converted his grief into guilt, and found guilt more bearable than helplessness. Cecily was exhausted and pale, and she reached for his hand across the coverlet. He came to take it, and then did not, and after a moment left the room. The dowager came to see her the following afternoon. She sat in the chair by the bed and arranged her skirts and said, without looking directly at Cecily, "Every branch of the Ashmore line has been strong. The difficulty appears to be particular." She paused. "Edmund requires heirs. It is not an unkindness to acknowledge what is plainly the case." Cecily had looked at the ceiling. "I have been delivered of 2 children, Your Grace. Neither survived." "Precisely," the dowager said, and rose and left. In March of 1812, a solicitor arrived, not Mr. Silas Pruett, who was Cecily's own man of business in Bath and had served her father before her. This was another man, a Mr. Farrow, whose firm was in Bristol and whose engagement Cecily had never been consulted about. He produced a deed of separation, already signed with Edmund's name and seal, and explained its terms in the brisk, abbreviated manner of a man who expected no questions. The separation was a legal instrument, not a divorce. It conveyed a sum of £400 annually, to be paid quarterly, and it released her from residence at Ashmore, and it was dated the 15th of April, 1812. Cecily read it twice. She asked where Edmund was. She was told he was in London, and had sent the document in his place. She could have contested it. The particular quality of her stillness in that moment, while Mr. Farrow watched her across the library table with the patient expression of a man who had performed this errand before, was not submission. It was calculation. She had no family of consequence, no political allies, no legal counsel present. She was 25 years old, in a house that had never fully acknowledged her claim to it, holding a document signed by its owner, in the presence of a man whose firm she did not know. The kind of fight she could make in that room would not be the kind of fight she could win. She signed the receipt and left with her trunk that afternoon. What she did not yet know was that she was already 6 weeks carrying. She discovered it in Bath, in lodgings on Pulteney Street, in April, in a quiet, careful conversation with a physician who had attended her family for years. She wrote to Edmund immediately. She wrote again in June, when the pregnancy was confirmed beyond any doubt, and again in August, when a physician certified that she was carrying 2 children. She wrote 4 letters in all, addressing them to Ashmore, and received no reply from any of them. Thomas and William were born in November of 1812, small and insistent, and not unlike their father in the particular set of their brows when they were displeased. Cecily looked at them for a long time after the midwife had cleaned them, and then she wrote one more letter to Ashmore, and then she did not write again. James arrived the following October, in 1813, with a disposition calmer than his brother's, and a gaze that fixed on whatever was in front of him, with a steadiness that she recognized at once. The £400 per year was paid, each quarter, with no accompanying correspondence. She engaged a small governess, a straightforward woman named Margaret, who came from Bristol and had no illusions about her situation, and she built, on Pulteney Street, and then on a quieter road just south of it, a life that was constrained and plain, and entirely her own. She had not planned to come to the wedding. The announcement reached her in May of 1815 in the Bath newspaper. Edmund, Duke of Ashmore, engaged to Lady Dorothea Vane, daughter of the Earl of Pemberton. Wedding set for the 14th of June at Ashmore. She put the paper down on the kitchen table and sat with it for a moment, and then she walked to the window and stood there while Thomas and William argued over a wooden horse in the adjoining room, and James watched them from the hearthrug with his accustomed gravity. Silas Prewett came to see her the following week. He was a dry, meticulous man who had handled her father's affairs for 15 years, and he had been, on her behalf and at his own initiative, making certain inquiries since 1813. He sat down in her small parlor, accepted tea, and produced from his case 3 documents, which he laid on the table without flourish. The first was a sworn statement from a clerk in Mr. Farrow's Bristol office, attesting that the deed of separation had been prepared at the instruction of a third party before it was presented to Edmund, and that the signatures had been obtained in sequence rather than simultaneously, the Duke's signature secured under a false summary of its contents. The second was a letter from a woman named Mrs. Roper, who had been a housemaid at Ashmore in 1812, stating that she had personally received and surrendered, on the Dowager's instruction, 2 letters addressed to the Duke of Ashmore, in a hand she recognized as the Duchess's. The letters were dated June and August of 1812. She had surrendered them because she had been told to, and she had not slept easily about it since. The third was a deposition from a senior figure in the Court of Chancery in London, indicating that on petition, a deed of separation obtained through suppressed evidence and a corrupted solicitor was voidable in equity, and that the original marriage, never having been legally dissolved, remained in effect. Cecily Hartwell was, at law and in fact, still the Duchess of Ashmore. The 3 boys were Edmund's legitimate heirs. Cecily sat with this information for 3 days. She did not weep. She did not draft triumphant correspondence. She thought about what it meant to present 3-year-old children at a house that had cast out their mother, and what it meant to arrive at a man's wedding with evidence that it was not legally possible, and what it would cost the children, later, if she did not. She went for Thomas's sake, and William's, and James's. Not for her own. She arrived at Ashmore's gate on the morning of the 13th of June, one day before the wedding, accompanied by Mr. Prewett, by Margaret with James on her hip, and by Thomas and William, who had been told they were going to a large house in the country, and had been promised they might see the horses. The June morning was warm and white-clouded. The estate's iron gate stood open for the delivery of wedding flowers, and Cecily drove through it in a hired post-chaise and felt the gravel of the drive under the wheels, and did not look away from the house. The housekeeper who came to the door was a woman she recognized, Mrs. Fenwick, who had been at Ashmore since before Edmund inherited. Mrs. Fenwick looked at Cecily. Her gaze moved to Thomas and William at either side, and to James on Margaret's hip, and back to Cecily's face. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said. Cecily did not correct the form of address. She understood that Mrs. Fenwick had used it deliberately, as a small act of placement. "I should like to speak to the Duke," Cecily said. "Mr. Prewett has documentation that I believe requires the Duke's attention before tomorrow's ceremony." She was given a small downstairs sitting room and a tea tray, and the information that the Duke was expected within the hour. The Dowager was in residence. She was not, as yet, aware of the arrival. Edmund arrived earlier than the hour. Cecily heard his footstep in the corridor before the door opened, that particular unhurried authority she remembered, and when he came in and stopped at the sight of her, she had already risen and was standing with her hands at her sides. He was 34 years old. He was gray at the temples in a way he had not been at 31. He looked at her as though he were calculating a distance he had not expected to have to calculate, and then his gaze went to Thomas and William, who were on the floor by the window, engaged with Margaret's traveling bag, and to James, who had fallen asleep against Margaret's shoulder. Something in his face underwent a change that was not small. "Your Grace," Cecily said. He said nothing for a moment. His jaw was as composed as stone. "Miss Alderton," he said. The name was wrong, and he knew it, and she watched him know it. "Mr. Prewett has documents I believe you require," she said. "I would ask that you examine them before any other conversation." He did not move. His eyes had not fully left the boy's. Thomas had looked up from the bag and was examining Edmund with the unself-conscious intensity of a child who has not yet learned that men in fine coats must be looked at differently. "Who are they?" he said. Not a question, something below a question. "Thomas and William," Cecily said. "They will be 3 years old in November." She paused. "James was born in October of 1813. He is 2. Edmund sat down in the nearest chair, without appearing to mean to. Mr. Prewett opened his case and began. The afternoon that followed was the longest Cecily had spent since the afternoon at the library table with Mr. Farrow and the separation deed. Edmund read each document in silence. He read Mrs. Roper's letter twice, and the second time he set it down on the table with a controlled deliberateness that Cecily recognized as the way he handled things he could not afford to feel entirely. She watched his face while he read, and she saw the specific moment when he reached the dates of the intercepted letters. June of 1812, August of 1812. His hands were still. His face was still. The stillness was doing considerable work. When he had read all 3 documents, he sat without speaking for a long time, and she did not speak either. William had fallen asleep beside James on the settee. Thomas was drawing shapes on the fogged window glass with one finger. Edmund said, "I thought you had gone willingly." "I know," Cecily said. "I thought when you did not write." "I wrote 5 times," she said. "The last was in November, the week after the boys were born." Thomas turned from the window and looked at them both with his father's particular expression, the one that was not judgment, but was observing very carefully, and Edmund looked at the boy for a moment with something in his face that Cecily would remember for the rest of her life, and could not fully have named. "There are guests arriving in the morning," Edmund said. "Lady Dorothea is expected this evening." "I am aware," Cecily said. "Mr. Prewett advises that the marriage as planned is not legally possible. I am not here to cause injury to Lady Dorothea, who, as I understand it, had no knowledge of the prior circumstances." Edmund stood. He walked to the window where Thomas had been drawing and looked out at the drive. "I would ask you to wait," he said, "while I consider what must be done." Cecily rose. She gathered James from the settee without waking him and handed him back to Margaret, and she straightened her dress and looked at Edmund's profile against the window glass. "I have waited 3 years," she said quietly. "I will not ask you for anything you do not choose to give, but I will not be placed in another small room while the matter is considered. I have Mr. Prewett's documents. I have 3 children, and I am still, at law, your wife. If that is to be addressed, it will be addressed before witnesses, not managed quietly to one side." She left the room with Margaret and the boys behind her. Edmund did not call her back. The Dowager found her in the corridor 10 minutes later. Lady Ashmore had not changed in 3 years, except to become more precisely herself. Her gray silk was impeccable, her back as straight as a rule, and she regarded Cecily from a distance of 4 feet with the calm authority of a woman who has spent 40 years ensuring that the world remained as it should be. "You should not have come," she said. "No," Cecily agreed pleasantly. "You should not have arranged what you arranged in 1812. But here we both are." The Dowager's fan moved a single measured beat. "This is a great house on the day before its master's wedding. Whatever papers your man of business has produced, they will require examination by counsel. They will require time, They will require process." She paused. "You are a clergyman's daughter who had 2 years in this house and failed at the one thing required of her. The barren wife returned with foundlings is a very particular kind of embarrassment, and I would spare you it, if you would permit me to do so." There it was, the same word the Dowager had used in 1812, in a letter to Edmund that Cecily had been shown by the housekeeper who had felt she ought to know. Barren wife. A diagnosis delivered with the confidence of one whose category system had never yet failed her. Cecily looked at her without heat. "Those foundlings are the Duke's legitimate sons," she said. "Mr. Prewet's documents are in order, and I expect they will bear examination. I will be in the blue room, which was my room before yours was given in its place, and I expect to see Edmund before this house receives its guests." She walked past the Dowager and did not look back. If this story has caught your attention so far, the best moments are still to come. Stay with it. The blue room was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she was standing in it differently. Margaret settled the boys on the large bed with their coats off, and Thomas inspected the room's every corner with the systematic attention he brought to new things, and William watched his brother and occasionally repeated his conclusions, and James sat on the pillow and looked at the ceiling rose with his characteristic absorption. Cecily sat in the single chair and watched them and thought about the morning. Edmund came to the room that evening, just before dinner was served in the main dining room where Lady Dorothea and her parents had arrived. He knocked, which was not what a man usually did at his own door in his own house, and she took that as information. She admitted him. He stood in the doorway and looked at the 3 boys on the bed, Thomas and William now asleep against each other in the particular arrangement of children who have never in their lives slept alone, and James still awake, regarding him. James looked at Edmund for a long moment with those steady, accustomed eyes, and then reached one hand out toward him from across the room. Edmund's face did something it had not done in the drawing-room earlier. A crack appeared in the stone. Small, specific, undeniable. He came to sit at the foot of the bed. He sat there for a while without speaking, and James, apparently satisfied, went to sleep. "She did not know," Edmund said at last. "Dorothea, I want to be clear about that. She was told the separation was properly conducted. I believe the same." "I know that," Cecily said. "I will speak to her tonight." He was quiet. "And to her father. The situation will require careful management, and it will cause her a considerable injury. I am not easy about that." "Nor am I," Cecily said. "But her injury is reversible. My son's legitimacy was not if I had remained silent." He nodded slowly. He was looking at Thomas and William, at the identical dark brows and the identical set of sleep-slack mouths, and she watched him reading himself into them. "What I said about waiting," he said. "You need not address it tonight." "I need to tell you something tonight," he said, and his voice was different, lower, with a quality of difficulty she recognized from the corridor outside her room in February of 1812, when he had sat for 8 hours and had not known what to say. "I drove you away, not Pharaoh, not the deed, before any of that, after Eleanor." He stopped. "Eleanor," Cecily said. She had not known the name. He had never said it. "The child we lost in February," he said. "I gave her a name afterward, alone, when no one knew. Eleanor." He looked at his hands. "I did not go to you when I should have. I went to my guilt instead, and I made it yours to carry. And by the time Pharaoh arrived with the deed, I think I had allowed myself to believe that signing it was what you would want, because it was easier than acknowledging what I had done." Cecily sat with this for a moment. The fire in the room had been lit by a housemaid, and was burning low and steady, and the light it cast across the bed where the boys slept was amber and warm. "I was not blameless either," she said carefully. "I could have fought harder in that library. I chose not to, because I was exhausted, and I felt what you had made me feel, that I was a problem to be resolved." He looked at her then. "You were never that. I know," she said, and the weight she put on those 2 words was 3 years, and 5 unread letters, and 3 small children on a bed in Bath, and he heard it all. She did not ask him for anything that night. She thanked him for coming, and she said she expected he had a great deal to attend to before morning, and he looked at her for a moment with the quality of attention she had first noticed at a dinner party in Bath in 1809, when she had picked up her fork and the room had gone quiet, and then he left. The morning came white and warm, the June light falling in long slanted lines through the hall's east windows. White roses still stood at the gallery rails. The footmen were still at their posts. The guests had been assembled in the great hall since 9:30, and Lady Dorothea stood near the entrance in ivory silk, composed and pale and very still. Her father stood at her left. The dowager stood at the hall's far end near the gallery stair, and the expression she wore was controlled. But Cecily could see from the doorway where she had entered with Prewett and Margaret and the 3 boys that it was controlled at considerable effort. Edmund was at the top of the stair. Cecily had not expected him to be there yet. She had expected to have to send word, to wait at the edge of things again as she had waited for 3 years in Bath. His presence at the top of the stair, in his wedding clothes, looking directly at her from the moment the door opened, told her that he had arranged this himself, that he had placed himself there deliberately, that the assembled guests, the white roses, and the ivory-clad woman near the entrance were witness to something he had determined they would witness. The room had gone quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when a door opens, and the thing that enters it changes the atmosphere. The dowager crossed from the gallery stair in 6 even steps, which was the fastest Cecily had ever seen her move, and planted herself between Cecily and the hall's center with the placid certainty of a woman who had managed this house and its events for 30 years. "This," she said, in a voice precisely calibrated to carry to the nearest 6 guests and no further, "is not the person you believe her to be. She is a dismissed dependent, returned with children whose origins have not been established on a day she was not invited and has no business attending." There was the 3rd voicing, the same calculation in different clothes. Dismissed dependent, where once it had been Barren wife, where once before that it had been clergyman's daughter. The same sentence, really. The same verdict. The dowager had addressed the nearest 6 guests. But 6 guests in a hall of 40 speak to one another. And within 30 seconds, the whole hall was looking. Cecily stood in the doorway with Thomas and William at either hand, and James on Margaret's hip, and Mr. Prewett at her left shoulder, and she did not move, and did not speak, and did not look at the dowager at all. She looked at Edmund. Edmund came down the stair. He came down without haste, with the measured authority he brought to everything. But he did not stop at the hall's bottom. He kept walking. He walked the full length of the hall in 12 strides, and the crowd divided for him, as crowds always did. And he stopped in front of Cecily, and looked at her for a moment, in which the only sound in the great hall was the small breath of 40 people choosing to be very quiet. "Cecily," he said. Not Miss Alderton, not Mrs. Hartwell. Her name, the one he had used in the chapel in 1809 when the vicar asked him to say it aloud. Thomas, who had not in his 3 years and 7 months of life developed a strong instinct for restraint, chose this moment to say, in a clear, carrying voice, "Papa." He had been told. He had been told carefully by Cecily the previous evening, in language a 3-year-old could receive without injury, that the tall man in the large house was their father. He had received this information with Thomas's characteristic gravity, held it overnight, and now produced it at the precise moment it would do the most work. William said it a beat later, because William followed his brother's lead in all things. The hall, which had been quiet, was now something below quiet. Edmund crouched to their height. He looked at Thomas and then at William, and his face was the cracked stone she had seen the evening before, except now the crack was considerably wider. He put one hand on each of their dark heads, and when he rose he was not quite composed in the way he had been coming down the stairs. He turned to Prewett. "You have the documents." "I do, Your Grace." "Present them." Edmund looked at the room, at the guests who were looking at him, at Lady Dorothea by the entrance, whose face had gone very still, at the Dowager, who had not moved but whose fan had ceased its measured motion. "Mr. Prewett will establish the legal circumstances for anyone who requires them," he said. "The marriage planned for this morning will not proceed. The marriage that took place in the autumn of 1809 was never dissolved, and the 3 children present are my legitimate heirs." He looked at the Dowager, and his voice did not change in pitch or volume. "The separation deed of April 1812 was obtained by fraud. This has been established by counsel and will be confirmed by the Court of Chancery on petition." The Dowager's fan dropped a degree, a very small distance, barely enough to measure, but Cecily measured it. "Edmund," she said. "Your Grace," he said. Not your mother, not Mama, which he had used in private, the formal title of a man addressing a peer, not the address of a son. She heard what it meant. The Dowager's composure held. She was too old and too practiced for it to shatter in a hall of 40 guests. But it reorganized, carefully, into something different from what it had been. A woman who had always known the precise dimensions of her authority and was now recalculating them with the precision she brought to everything. She looked at Cecily, and Cecily looked back at her, and what passed between them was not triumph and not malice, but something more like a mutual acknowledgement that a particular kind of certainty had run out. Near the entrance, Lady Dorothea spoke to her father in a low voice. She had not made a scene, not wept, not raised her chin in the performance of injury. She had simply, on hearing Edmund's words, become a young woman who understood that the room had shifted irreversibly and who chose to exit it with her dignity whole. She looked at Cecily once, from across the hall, and her expression, as Prewett would later confirm to Cecily, was not resentment, but something quieter. She had not known. She looked like a woman absorbing the cost of what others had arranged without her knowledge, and absorbing it steadily. Her father took her arm and she left, and the hall gave them room. Prewett opened his case. He produced the clerk's statement, Mrs. Roper's letter, and the Chancery deposition, and he set them on the hall's central table for examination and said, in his dry, methodical voice, that he was prepared to speak to any of their contents. He was a good solicitor. He did not editorialize. Edmund turned back to Cecily. The hall was still watching. This was not a private moment, and neither of them had chosen it to be. This was the same arena in which the Dowager had delivered her verdict, and Edmund had crossed it deliberately. And whatever was said now would be said before witnesses, which was exactly what she had told him the previous evening that she required. "I cannot give back the 3 years," he said. "I will not ask you to accept that I could not have done more to deserve your trust before they were taken." He was looking at her with that particular quality, the Bath dinner party quality, as though everything around them had gone slightly out of focus, and she was the thing remaining sharp. I am asking whether you will stay." Cecily looked at him for a long moment. Thomas had taken hold of Edmund's coat with one small hand and was engaged with the button, and Edmund had not looked down at him but was aware of him, in the way she had learned to identify. The particular stillness of a man who cannot acknowledge what is happening to him without the acknowledgement breaking something open. "I am still your wife," she said. "I never stopped being your wife. And those are your sons, and this is their house, and I will not remove them from it to spare anyone discomfort." She paused. "But I will not remain where I am managed, or placed, or decided for. I will remain where I am chosen. That is the only condition I have ever had." He said, "Then you are chosen." There were no more words from either of them immediately after that. There did not need to be. The hall had heard it, which was the point, and it had been heard by the footmen at their posts, and the guests in their silk and broadcloth, and by Mrs. Fenwick, who stood at the corridor entrance with her hands folded and her face composed, and the expression of someone who has been waiting 3 years for a particular ledger to balance. Margaret shifted James on her hip, and James, looking at his father from a short distance, opened and closed his hand in the small approximate wave that was his customary greeting, and Edmund finally looked at him. He reached across and took James from Margaret's arm, and James regarded him for a moment with the solemn absorption he brought to all new things, and then tucked his head under Edmund's chin in the matter-of-fact way of a child who has made a decision. The hall began, slowly, to breathe again. Prewett gathered his documents. Guests spoke to one another in the low, reconstructive tones of people adjusting their understanding of an event. Mrs. Fenwick moved to speak to the head footman. The white roses stood at the gallery rails, and the morning light moved through the east windows in its long, warm slants. And Ashmore looked, for the first time in Cecily's experience of it, like a house in which she was at home. It was autumn before the formal matters were concluded. Prewett's petition to the Court of Chancery was granted in September, confirming what he had told them in June. The separation deed was void. The marriage of 1809 remained in full effect. Thomas and William and James were legitimate heirs to the duchy in order of their birth. The quarterly payments, which had continued through the summer with the particular administrative inertia of arrangements that no one had yet formally cancelled, were discontinued at Cecily's request in October. The dowager retired to the dower house at the estate's east boundary, which was a large and comfortable establishment with its own gardens and a drawing room whose dimensions were suited to her position and her habits. She came to dinner at the main house on Sundays. She was civil. She was never again less than that in Cecily's presence, which was a kind of acknowledgment that Cecily received without ceremony and filed away without satisfaction. It was enough. The morning of the first autumn Sunday dinner, Cecily had arrived in the east drawing-room to find the dowager already seated, and Margaret bringing James in from the garden, and Thomas and William on the floor with a puzzle of 30 pieces that the housekeeper had found in the nursery cupboard. The dowager watched the 3 boys for a long, quiet moment, and then she looked at Cecily. And for the first time in 6 years of acquaintance, she did not say anything at all. Cecily sat down and poured the tea. By November, the house had settled into itself. The nursery on the upper floor was reorganized by Margaret, with the particular system she had developed in Bath, and the additional advantage of considerably more room. The household accounts, which Cecily had requested from the steward in July, and reviewed over 3 weeks with the same thorough attention she had given them in 1810, were in reasonable order, with several adjustments she proposed, and Edmund accepted without modification. The 1,200 acres were, for the most part, well managed. The tenant in the north cottage had a leaking roof, which was addressed. Thomas had the horses he had been promised. He and William visited them every morning with Edmund, who had discovered that his eldest sons had strong and largely opposed opinions about which horse was the most admirable, and that managing both opinions required a diplomatic patience that he found, to his measured surprise, he did not mind deploying. On an evening in late November, with the fire drawing well in the library and the first frost whitening the garden beyond the glass, the boys were asleep upstairs under Margaret's supervision, and Cecily and Edmund sat on either side of the fire with the particular quiet of two people who have found that they can occupy the same silence comfortably. Edmund said, "I want to tell you something." She looked up from the letter she was reading. "When she was born," he said, "and I sat in the corridor, and I could not go in to you." He looked at the fire. "I told myself afterward that I had been afraid of making it worse. That you had your grief, and I had mine, and they would collide. And I could not manage that." He was quiet. "That was true. It was also a reason I permitted myself to use, because the real thing underneath it was that I felt I had failed her. Eleanor. And sitting with you would have required admitting that to myself, and to you." "You had not failed her," Cecily said. "I know that now," he said. "I did not know it then." She set down her letter. The fire was the only light in the room, and it cast everything in amber and warm, moving shadow. And outside the frost was settling on the dormant garden in the particular silence of a night when the world has gone entirely still. "Eleanor," she said. The name sat between them, finally spoken aloud by both of them, in a room they both occupied. I used to say it to myself in Bath, when I was very tired. I thought perhaps you had given her a name, and I used that one, but I did not know. Edmund looked at her across the fire. You had given her the same one, he said. She had. She had not known, and he had not known, and in separate houses in separate years they had said the same name to the same child in the particular private language of grief. This was the thing she had not known until now, and it moved through her chest quietly, like a door opening in a house she had thought was shut. She rose and crossed to his chair and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her without speaking, and they sat there for a long time with the fire going, and the frost outside, and the house above them full of sleeping children. This is where the story ends, in that warmth, in that light, in the room they were both finally in together. If it moved you, leave a word in the comments. There are more stories here for anyone who stays. In the morning, Thomas would demand his horses before breakfast, and William would follow, and James would watch from the doorway with his level considering gaze, and Ashmore would be loud and argumentative and thoroughly inhabited. But that night, the fire burned low and even, and the frost lay white on the garden Edmund had planted in the year of his first marriage, and neglected in the years of his grief, and Cecily Hartwell, Duchess of Ashmore, rested her head against her husband's shoulder in the room where she was at home. Eleanor's name had been spoken. It had been received. It was enough.